we want to ask you in reference to video violence. Can you explain to us between the correlation of evidence of constellation?
Right. So the difference between correlational studies and studies that we can show cause and effect. There's two broad, in all areas of research, there's two types of studies. One type of study are these field studies in which you basically give questionnaires. So in the world of video games, you'd probably give a questionnaire to some kids and ask them, do you play violent video games, yes or no? And then you'd assess some sort of outcome, like violent behavior. And they were able to find links, and they do find links between children who play violent video games and who are aggressive. Of course, the problem with that type of research is you can't draw a causal relationship, because it could be that kids who are naturally violent are more attracted to violent video games to start off with, so you don't really know what comes first. Then we have lab studies where we can draw cause and effect, and that's where we manipulate. So we have some people play a violent video game for a set period of time, and another set play a non-violent video game for a set period of time, and then we assess them on some type of outcome. So rather it be some type of response on a questionnaire or some type of game essentially set up to assess aggression. That type of situation, we can draw cause and effects. Now, both studies have strengths and weaknesses. So the field studies, the strength is it's in the real world. The weakness is we can't draw cause and effect. The lab study is, the strength is we can draw cause and effect, but it's not in the real world. It's in this very artificial setting. And so what you really have to do is take both types of studies and put them together and think of them simultaneously. An analogy can be made very loosely to smoking and cancer. Not that I'm at all implying video games are at any level of that. But with smoking studies, you have naturalistic studies where you trace people who smoke and assess their lung cancer. And then you also have experimental studies on rats or some type of animal usually where you give them nicotine and assess their cancer. And with both sets of studies, they both point in the same direction, we assume that X does cause Y. And with video games, we do see that. But we have to be very careful about this. And this is, I think, usually on both sides of the argument on the video games, that both sides get it wrong. That one side wants to note that like video games have this gigantic cause and effect relationship. And the other side wants to argue that there's absolutely no relationship at all. But what we find in research is it's not this simple. It's not like a light switch that video games do or do not. It's much more like a dimmer switch. And we can look across all studies that have been done, and there's been several meta-analyses done. Probably the most prominent are Anderson's, Sherry's, and Ferguson's. And they all point to about the same size of an effect. And how we assess effects is using a Pearson correlation, which essentially ranges, in this case, it would range from basically 0 to 1. A 1 would mean, wow, that's gigantic, that's the only thing causing it. A 0 would mean no effect at all. And what we find with video games is the effect size is about 0.17. So it's very small. It is positive. It's going in the positive direction, so there is an effect. But it's not as if it's a child's picking up a game and instantly they're becoming, psychotic. It's a very small effect. It's a consistent effect, but small. And more recent research actually suggests from our lab and other labs is that this effect is really only consistent in certain types of individuals, specifically individuals with predispositions before they ever played the video game. So certain psychological profile of, say, an adult or a child might make the violent video games have a greater effect on them. It's a small proportion of our population, so this isn't everybody, but it's just these certain types of individuals. So in some ways, the answer to the question if violent video games, do they have an effect, it's not so simple as yes or no. It's very complex in that, yes, they have an effect. The effect is generally pretty small, and only for a very small subset of individuals with certain predispositions, does this effect tend to become magnified.
Anyone have a question? Representative.
How you doing, Dr. Markey?
Fantastic.
Thanks for coming here today. The written testimony of Sally Jefferson, it's a report that was provided to the committee. Page 3. Pages aren't marked.
I don't have any.
Second full paragraph down, I'll read it to you. Okay. Essentially, Sally Jefferson indicates that, quote, there is no scientific research that validates a causal link between violent media, including computer and video games, and violence. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
Again, this is a complicated issue. It depends on how you look at the question. In some ways, she's absolutely right. There's no causal link in the real world. Again, because we can't go into a house and make a child play a violent video game for 6 months and then see what happens 2 years later. That we don't have the funds to do that type of research. So, again, you have to look at it. There is causal evidence in a laboratory setting, so in a very synthetic setting where we manipulate, one group plays a violent video game, the other group doesn't, then later on we assess them on some sort of outcome, we do find an effect. Now, it's important to remember this is a very short term. This is usually just an hour after they play the game or so. So it's incorrect to say there's absolutely no causal relationship. But would be also incorrect to assume that that causal relationship happens in the real world. We simply don't know from our research. And again, that's a limitation of every type of research that's ever done, is we can't make people in the real world do things. We can't randomly assign people to conditions in their everyday lives.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? We have been joined by Representative Cox. Welcome. And I want to just go back to a couple of questions from you, if I may, Doctor. Let me ask it a different way. We try to keep alcohol out of the way of children. Children under really 18, it's difficult after they get to be 16, 17. But we do that as a society because they are impressionable and because we don't want them to become alcoholics. We try to keep cigarettes away because we don't want them to become smokers. We feel it's injurious to their health. And yet, I guess I want to say it out straight. You don't find, or do you find, that violence in the home, which we try to prevent them from seeing or experiencing, and yet on video games it is not but a little bit of difference or a little bit impressionable?
Yeah, I mean, all I can talk to is what the research suggests.
And that's what the research is showing.
If you look across studies and you essentially, if you will, think of it as averaging the effect size every single study has found, which is what these meta-analyses do. So looking at hundreds of studies, you find the average effect size. You find it's right around that 0.17 number.
Except what was the percentage you gave me?
Well, again, that's why it's hard to think of it as it ranges from 0 to 1, a correlation coefficient, with 0.17 being very slow. It's hard to put it in kind of common sense terms, if you will. But I mean, you can almost tell from just the possibility of its length that it's on the lower end. I certainly, again, there's been no research that I'm aware of that has directly compared home and like how much of an effect does a home environment have next to a video game. But I would have to think that a home environment would have a much more dramatic effect than staring at a television set. Again, it's not saying staring at a television set and playing a violent video game is not a bad thing. These are different degrees. So I don't think it's quite fair to compare them with each other. That's certainly watching a parent abuse his or her, the child's mother or father, is a very different experience than playing a video game. Again, I'm not saying the violent video games don't have any effect, but it's just that I don't know if it's quite fair to compare the two with each other.
Okay, are there any